Welcome to Dwell on These Things, a podcast of Dwell Community Church in Columbus, Ohio, where we discuss whatever is honorable, pure, lovely, commendable, excellent, and praiseworthy.
Welcome to Dwell on These Things. I'm Pat Reeder, Director of Equipping here at Dwell Community Church. With me today is Abby Merker, one of our counselors and course teachers, and Rebecca McLaughlin, speaker and author of Confronting Christianity and many other books. Thanks for joining us at the Xenos Summer Institute.
It's great to be here.
So, funny story. As late as this Tuesday, I discovered I might not know how to pronounce your name. I came into the office and said, Rebecca McLaughlin, such and such, and someone very sternly corrected me and said, Rebecca McLaughlin. And I was like, I didn't even know what to say. I was confused. So I was like, well, maybe that's right. I've been saying McLaughlin the entire time. They're saying McLaughlin the entire time. And so I go online. I'm like, let's try to find this out. And actually, I discovered there was an additional pronunciation. McLaughlin was thrown out. Your assistant helped us and let us know that it is indeed McLaughlin. But I wanted to ask, have you heard other pronunciations other than those three? And just how many are there out there?
Well, I'm going to answer a different question.
That's fine.
Because I'm married to a guy from Oklahoma. And I said to him, I will change my name to yours if you start pronouncing your name correctly. So his whole family says McLaughlin, which is the typical American way to say it, I believe. But I say McLaughlin, and I just spell it. Like anytime I'm giving my name on, the phone to the doctors or something, I go, Rebecca McLaughlin, McLaughlin, because I know that Americans, and they were like, oh, McLaughlin. I'm like,
no, McLaughlin.
McLaughlin. So it's a good Scotch-Irish name, and I feel like it should be pronounced correctly.
All right, that's fantastic.
Good. So, first up, what made you decide to start writing? And maybe specifically, how did you pick the topics that you wanted to write about?
Yeah, I've been a Christian for pretty much as long as I can remember. And even from relatively young, when I was sort of 9, 10, 11, most of my friends were not Christians at all. I was growing up in London. I was going to kind of expensive, fancy academic schools where Christianity was culturally present in that maybe we'd sing hymns and like morning assembly, but actually pretty much laughed at by most of my contemporaries and even some of the teachers at the school. So from an early age, I have been wanting to tell people about Jesus and knowing that there are particular roadblocks, I guess, to people considering faith in Jesus. And often, really good reasons people have for not being interested in Christianity, whether it's a sense of Christianity being anti-intellectual and like discredited and disproved by science or history, or whether it's, and I think more and more the case today, kind of moral questions around, the record of Christians' complicity in racism or the abuse scandals of the last several years, or the ways in which Christians have often acted like genuinely hatefully toward people who identify as gay or lesbian.
Right.
Yikes.
So all these kind of moral questions, intellectual and moral questions that, to say, function as roadblocks to people's faith in Jesus. And so that was always a personal concern for me in conversations. And I went to seminary in the UK. I did an undergrad, master's, and PhD in English literature, partly because I loved studying Shakespeare and partly because actually I loved the opportunity to talk with fellow students who had come from all over the world, most of them not Christians at all, and just it was a great opportunity to be alongside folks and sharing my faith with them. And then I went to seminary thinking that maybe one day I would have some sort of speaking ministry, because that was something I had more of a kind of background and training in. Mm-hmm. Along the way, as I mentioned, married a guy from Oklahoma. It's very hard to find a good kind of evangelical man in England, turns out. So you kind of have to resort to these foreigners.
The expatriates.
And he was very keen to move back to the US. So after we both finished with our studies, we moved to Cambridge, Mass. And I started working for a ministry called the Veritas Forum, where the model of that ministry was to partner with campus ministries at universities, sort of leading secular universities across the US and in Europe as well, and to help them host events where Christianity would be explored by people who had credibility within the university. So often it was Christian professors who were talking about their faith in Jesus and how it related to their research, and sometimes in dialogue with non-Christian professors from various different backgrounds. And I spent nearly 10 years working with these folks and kind of getting to know these amazing experts in their fields, from fields as diverse as like psychology to philosophy to history to science, and hearing their stories of faith, how they think about their faith in relationship with their areas of research. And by the end of that time, I felt like I had a roadmap of where the best research actually was and the best sort of Christian thinking was happening on a whole range of issues. And so I sat down to write Confronting Christianity, my first book, to look at what seemed to me to be the 12 biggest kind of objections or obstacles to faith in Jesus, and to bring to bear the stories and research of, many of these professors who I'd encountered, and sort of offer that to a general audience. And in the process of writing that book, I discovered that I really love writing books. So I've kind of got a small book writing addiction, and now I just write books all day long.
Well, we love that. We're eating them up. Actually, on that point, I've observed in reading your books that you are uncommonly sympathetic, and there's a real heart of love towards people who are grappling with these questions. And, there can be at times a sort of thin line between godly apologetics and just all-out culture wars. And I wanted to just ask if you had advice on how to engage seriously and thoughtfully with these hard questions while also maintaining that sympathetic heart for the people who are grappling with these questions.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is just reading our Bibles carefully. So Peter, in his first letter, says that we should always be ready to give a reason for the hope that we have, but that we should do so with gentleness and respect.
Yeah.
Jesus famously tells us to love our enemies.
Yeah.
We see time and again in the New Testament this call to love. And I think that has to shape how we share the gospel with non-Christians and how we engage, especially on these issues that can be kind of roadblocks to faith, because we're not in the business of winning arguments and kind of knocking people down. We're actually in the business of lovingly trying to win people for Christ. And so a lot of it just, I think, let's go back to the Bible and see what it is actually, not only what is it telling us to do, but how is it telling us to do that, should be shaping how we have these conversations. And I think alongside that, just actually get to know people. It's always striking to me, as I listen to various Christian leaders, I feel like it's quite easy to tell the Christian leaders who have genuine relationships with non-Christians from those who don't. I mean, actually, Tim Keller was a great example of this. Evidently somebody who actually had spent a lot of time getting to know non-believers in New York.
Yeah.
So they weren't just categories for him. They weren't just enemies and opponents and sort of straw men that he could magic out of the air. He was sitting and having real conversations with real people. And I feel very privileged to have a bunch of real people in my life who are not Christians, who are, many of them, highly intelligent, very loving and compassionate people who might be just as well, motivated as I am, and come to radically different conclusions than me on all sorts of things. And that, I'm not saying there is no right answer. For example, a question like abortion. I think it is absolutely the case that human life begins at conception, and that unborn babies are human beings made in the image of God whose lives should be protected. I don't think it's like an agree to disagree issue or like a question of kind of lack of clarity. Mm-hmm. At the same time, I know I have non-Christian friends who, because of their concern for justice and because of their desire to care for the poor and the oppressed, have strongly pro-choice views, as they would see.
Right.
And I think until we can, if we only frame a conversation like that as if our opponents are either stupid or fundamentally immoral. Now, of course, from a Christian perspective, all of us are fundamentally immoral. So I'm
Right.
not saying like we have to assume they only have pure motives. They don't, and frankly, nor do we. But until we recognize, oh no, my opponents, sort of my ideological enemies, as it were, could be just as thoughtful and compassionate as I am. And that could actually be driving their conclusions. Until I recognize that, I'm not going to be able to understand why they believe what they believe. And I'm not going to be able to speak helpfully to them if I just approach them as someone who's like probably stupid and immoral.
Yeah.
So I think, just having those real relationships and not oversimplifying things while also being very clear about the truth.
Yeah, if I could summarize, you made a lot of excellent points there, some of which we heard from John Lennox when he was here roughly 10 years ago about the importance of knowing Scripture and how knowledge of the Scripture is kind of the best apologetic. But he also, like you were saying, was friends with some of these people he was debating. He developed friendships with, Christopher Hitchens, from what I understand, and, was really rubbing shoulders with folks like that. And I also really liked your point. I studied philosophy at Ohio State, got my PhD there, and I really resonate with your point about understanding where they're coming from. So many times people just have a bumper sticker version of what other people believe, and it's like you should be able to repeat back to them their view in a way that they would accept it.
Yeah.
And at that point, you're in a position to really seriously engage with them.
Yeah. And we hate it when people don't do that for us, right? I tell a story in Confronting Christianity of the first time I was involved in a sort of pro-life demonstration, and the people on the other side were chanting, "Pro-life, that's a lie. You don't care if women die."
Right.
And I remember at the time thinking, like, that's so far from what I believe.
Right.
And they were just, caricaturing my beliefs and my motivations. It was a full scale assault on who I am and what I believe, kind of thing. But often as Christians, we do the same in reverse, and we sometimes say to ourselves, "Well, that's what they're doing to us, so we have the right to do it back to them." No, we do not.
That seems unwise.
if we look at what the New Testament says, Jesus saying, "Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you."
Right.
We actually are specifically told not to use other people's weapons back against them.
Yeah.
And we need to be really careful because it's very tempting to do that.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. Apologetics can be a bit of a boys' club. How has it been navigating that world?
I think you're right. Historically, it has been a bit of a boys' club, and I think that's a shame. Not because guys haven't done good work, but because I do think it's something that's important for men and for women. It hasn't been a problem for me, to be honest. I went to a college in Cambridge that was vast majority male. It was known for mathematics principally, and in my year there were like 44 mathematicians, four of whom were female. I then went to seminary, and I was one of 4 women in the entire year. So I guess I'm just sort of,
You're used to it.
I'm not perturbed by having a lot of guys around, but I do think it's increasingly. Sorry, I do think it's increasingly important that we equip men and women in the church with apologetics, and that we equip them to have real conversations with real people. Yeah. One of the things that I try to do in my books is, rather than as historically most apologetics books have kind of written to Christians and said, "Hey, here's how you could talk to your non-Christian friend," I actually try to do the opposite and write to your non-Christian friend. Yeah. And so, not because I think that my books are mostly going to be bought by non-Christians, they're not, but because my hope is a Christian will read one of my books and have then just some help in terms of how they might talk to a friend, and that they could give the book directly to a friend and say, "Hey, would you be interested in reading this?" and us chatting about it together.
Yeah, I observed that when I read it. It seemed as though, I don't know if you said it in the preface or whatever, but I observed when I was reading, I was like, this is written for someone that's actually asking these questions.
Yeah.
Like, it was clear that was the audience, and I thought that was pretty encouraging for that exact reason. It's like, hey, would you like to read this with me? Or, you just hand it to somebody. We we have some literature around here like that. A book one of our founding pastors wrote called Discovering God that's written that way as well. It's sort of like, this is for you, read it, and to interact that way.
Mm-hmm. So what kind of questions do you wish that more Christian women were asking?
I think whether we're male or female, it's important that we're wrestling with the questions that non-believers around us are wrestling with. Mm-hmm. And on average, women in our culture are more likely to be deeply concerned about questions of justice and compassion and care for the oppressed. So it's perhaps particularly important for women to be theologically formed and to have helpful things to say on questions, ranging from abortion to same-sex sexual relationships to transgender identity, to immigration, to like all the kinds of issues that are framed, rightly or wrongly, framed in terms of justice for the oppressed. Because again, just on average, that's more a concern that women have typically. And I think one of the things that it's important for us to recognize as Christian women is that instinct to care about the oppressed is a profoundly Christian instinct. Mm-hmm. And I think in terms of persuading anybody of anything, but it's particularly important to understand in terms of apologetics, we actually need to start with the common ground that we have with a non-believing friend. So rather than starting with, here's why I think you're wrong, we need to start with, here's where I think you're right. Mm-hmm. You seem to me to be deeply concerned for the poorest and most vulnerable people in our society. And actually that's something that Jesus modeled and taught day in, day out. Even if we look at the history of ideas, we'll find that Christianity is the basis for our deep modern concern for the poor and the oppressed. It's not just a sort of self-evident truth that all human beings are fundamentally equal, and so the poor and the marginalized shouldn't be trampled on by the rich and the strong, as it were. That's actually a particularly Christian belief. Mm-hmm. And I think we can start with that and say, I share that concern with you, but here's why, as a Christian, I actually think that concern, may drive me to a different conclusion than you on this question. Mm-hmm. And so I think, just starting with that place of like, okay, where can I agree with this person? Where can I actually affirm their beliefs and where they're coming from? What's the common ground on which I can build? Because actually none of us really want to listen to somebody who's sort of shouting to us across the, across the gap. We're all much more likely to be persuaded by somebody who comes alongside us and says, hey, I get where you're coming from, and I agree with, much of your heart here. But actually Jesus offers, for those who do long for justice and who do long for the poor to be cared for and for the oppressed to be protected, Jesus offers us the most robust vision for that of any human being in all of human history. So let's look at him together.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the book by Tom Holland that you referenced last night, Dominion. And so are you saying that all of our listeners should just pick up that 700-page book and read it?
I mean, not necessarily. I do love Tom Holland. I'm actually listening to his podcast at the moment called The Rest is History, which is so good. A friend of mine called Glenn Scrivener, who's Australian but lives in the UK, has written a short book which he describes himself as Tom Holland for dummies, called The Air We Breathe, which is a sort of shorter, quicker read, but covering some similar ground to Tom Holland, looking at the last 2,000 years of Christian history and how Jesus' teaching has actually shaped how we think today, to the extent that many in our culture who don't identify as Christian at all, may even identify with a different religious tradition, actually are using Christian ethics as their foundations without realizing it.
Right.
So your latest book, which is Jesus Through the Eyes of Women, right?
Nope.
What was the most recent one?
Well, it depends how you look at it. I have one coming out in September, which is the most recent in terms of like breaking news.
No one's read that yet.
okay.
Okay.
Which is going to be called No Greater Love, A Biblical Vision for Friendship.
Love it.
Excellent.
But I would be very glad to talk about Jesus Through the Eyes of Women, which came out last year. But a couple of books, including Is Easter Unbelievable, have come out since then. But anyway, carry on. Sorry.
Okay. Jesus Through the Eyes of Women.
Yes.
So, an encouraging read, scripturally focused. I really enjoyed it. What other resources, I guess? Okay, so your book's great. Everybody should read it. But what other resources would you recommend along the lines of this topic and empowering women and encouraging women to sort of look at, the history of women in Christianity and with Jesus? Other resources?
Yeah, that's a great question. I read remarkably few Christian books, so I'm not always the best to recommend. I tend to spend most of my time reading books by non-Christians or reading books, and Jesus Through the Eyes of Women is a great example of this. Books that are more technical and academic, and trying to kind of harvest the incredible fruits from those books and sort of chop them up and put them on a plate for people who aren't necessarily going to read the longer, more academic books. So Richard Borkham.
Cut the crust off.
Yeah,
for us,
exactly.
Cut it in triangles.
So Richard Borkham, who's this amazing British scholar, I think his most famous book is Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, which I would recommend to anyone who's interested in the Gospels and how we can have confidence that they're actually giving us access to eyewitness accounts. He also wrote a book called Gospel Women, where he's looking in particular at the named women in the Gospels and what we can learn from them. Again, it's a more technical academic read, but highly recommend it to anyone who's sort of up for that. And my book was trying to look at, like, both harvest what he was saying there, but look together at the named and unnamed women in the Gospels, because actually anonymous women are just as important in the Gospels as named ones can be in different ways. And I think just one of the most helpful things that people can do is just like read through the Gospels again with an eye to how Jesus is relating to women. And to not get tripped up on, I do think there's a kind of dangerous move that we can make sometimes where we think that, and I don't mean this, I don't mean to sort of be hypercritical on this, but when we talk about feeling empowered, there's definitely a positive sense in which we can feel empowered, in the sense of, like, you know, get up off your couch or wherever you are and like go and do the work that God's given you to do. But I think there's almost also a shadow side of that where we can think, oh, well, I need to have a higher sense of my own status, my own skills, my own whatever it is. And that will help me serve Jesus better. Actually, I don't think the Gospels tell us that. I think they tell us that we serve Jesus best when we recognize that we are at the bottom of the pile, and that when we come humbly, Jesus had to tell his disciples an embarrassing number of times that the greatest in his kingdom were the least. Famously said, anyone who wants to be great among you must be the slave of all, because even the Son of Man didn't come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. And so I think almost rather than encouraging women to feel empowered, I would encourage women to recognize that humility is an asset when it comes to meaningful gospel work, and that the large majority of meaningful gospel work is not done by people who are writing books or standing on stages. It's done by people who are engaging on an individual and small group level with others and sharing the gospel with them.
Cool. Good. So I think what's sort of interesting about what has been exciting about what you bring to the table, as I've been talking with people afterwards who are excited to hear what you have to say, feel inspired, to have a female mind that is not this old and stuffy broad that's like retired, but young and,
I'm going to make that my Twitter handle, Rebecca McLaughlin, not an old and stuffy broad.
There you go.
I love it.
You're welcome. But, you have young kids and, there's this sort of balancing act still obviously in your life, but you're, attacking these big topics. So it's inspiring, I think, to think that you can do both. It's not like, I don't know, once you like get married and you settle down and you have a couple kids and then you just have to take 10 years off from serving the Lord or something like that while you're making sandwiches and changing diapers. So are there other, I don't know, current female role models, or I guess you just said like, hey, serve where you're at. But are there other sort of female role models currently that you feel like are doing that, that are inspiring?
Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch, thankfully. My best friend, Rachel Gilson, is also writing books and talking about them. And in particular, she wrote a brilliant book called Born Again This Way, Coming to Faith and What Comes Next, which I recommend to anyone who's interested in Christian sexual ethics. She's writing especially from perspective of someone who discovered she was attracted to girls in high school, identified as an atheist by the time she was going to college, and had a sort of radical conversion experience. But then the book isn't just about her testimony. It's also about sort of theological reflection on everything from like marriage to friendship to singleness to all these good things. And she has one child who is 9. But yeah, I think we've often got ourselves caught up in the church in one of two mistakes. Either we have acted like, especially for women, getting married and having children is the thing. That's where all your identity should be, and that's where that's what everybody should be called to. And like if you don't get married and have children, then that's really unfortunate. We're not sure what to do with you, kind of thing, which is so thoroughly unbiblical. It's actually quite tragic that we propagate this view. And in fact, Paul specifically says that singleness is to be preferred to marriage. It seems like that's hardly ever preached in churches because we're so busy upholding marriage at the expense of singleness, when actually the counterpoint to marriage is not singleness, it is promiscuity, actually. So both faithful marriage and faithful singleness are equally valid and beautiful expressions of Christian discipleship. And I think you're right that especially for women, we sometimes say, okay, your first calling is to be a wife and a mother, and any kind of ministry comes second to that. And what we're doing there is first we're saying that caring for your children and raising them in the Lord isn't ministry, which is problematic in itself, because of course it is. But we sometimes say, okay, yes, your ministry now is raising your children, and all of your energy should be focused on them and raising your, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6 children, your brood in the Lord, and anything else deprioritized. Actually, I don't think that is a biblical model either, because in New Testament terms, the church is actually the primary family unit. So our idea that our nuclear family is like what comes first for Christians is not a very biblical idea. Jesus says, sort of shockingly, anyone who doesn't hate his mother and father and brother and sisters and wife and child, can't be my disciple. Now he's speaking in hyperbole there, because it's very clear in his teachings that he prizes marriage very highly. He prizes children very highly. He rebukes the Pharisees for the fact they're not caring for their parents properly.
The Korban.
Yeah, so we shouldn't take from that biological family is for the birds and doesn't matter.
Good.
At the same time, as I think about raising my children, I'm actually doing them a disservice if I am not embedding them in the local church. And if I'm thinking that raising them in the Lord is just down to my husband and me, it's not. It's down to God's people. So the role that adult Christians play in my children's lives is very precious and important. Both single and married adult Christians who invest in my children. And my children now, the older two are baptized believers, and are engaged in evangelism in their, quite hostile public schools. And my role as their mother is to come alongside them in discipleship, actually. It's not to sort of protect them until one day maybe they'll be disciples. It's not to kind of pull them out immediately when they're in a hard situation at school and when the opposition is really fierce and when they're losing friends and all that sort of thing. My role is actually sort of walk alongside them and say, yeah, it's really hard. And this is where I'm experiencing that in my life. And my role as well is to model for them what it looks like to care about the non-believers in our community and to reach out and to include and to invite and to share the gospel with all the means that I have. And if I was just modeling to them, my entire focus is you guys, I don't know that I'm actually setting them up well as future current believers. I don't think I'm setting them up well for their future life as disciples. I know that's like a really controversial thing to be saying.
Not around these parts.
Great, yeah.
But I think, I think bringing them along with me in the work that I'm trying to do before the Lord, and not getting hung up on whether like this is paid ministry or unpaid ministry, or whether it's like public ministry or private ministry or whatever. Those distinctions really don't matter. At the end of the day, what matters is what we'll answer to the Lord for, of what did we do with the opportunities that we had. And I would strongly counsel anybody not to sit around thinking, oh, like if only, I wish I could write a book, or I wish I could, give a talk or whatever. That's not the important thing. The important thing is sharing the gospel and loving those around you with all that you have. That's what Jesus is looking at right now in my life as well as in anybody else's.
Sure. Good.
That's awesome.
So how do you what's been helpful for you in terms of striking that balance? Okay, I want to invest in my kids. I want to disciple my kids. I want to teach them and train them. I'm responsible for them. And I've got other pursuits. I'm writing books and I'm, working for
Here in Columbus.
Right, you travel and, so how boundaries, I guess, what's been helpful for you in doing both?
Yeah, I think there are particular responsibilities that I have, especially as my kids are relatively young. Although I know from friends who have older teenagers, for instance, that often actually teenagers need their parents just as much as 4-year-olds do, actually. And it's sometimes in different ways, but that it's not that role decreases if things are going as we hope that they would be going. So I do have to say no to a lot of things. I remind myself quite often that there are very few people who actually need me. And that's, my husband and my kids actually need me. My close friend, like my local community needs me. I mean, I don't want to make that sound weird, but like there are people who rightfully have a claim on my time. And then there are many, many people who will be just fine without me. So I say no to a lot, especially a lot of travel, because I do want to be as present for my kids as I can be. At the same time, I once asked an older Christian friend who'd raised 3 children to be seemingly functional adults who love the Lord. And I was like, hey, tell me your top parenting tips. And she said, number 1, have a life that isn't them.
Cool.
And number 2 was fan the flames of their faith. And number 3 was basically make it clear to them, help them to understand that they are not the center of the universe. And people can take that to an extreme of like being neglectful of their children. I'm not advocating that. At the same time, I think it's a very modern expectation we have, especially of mothers, that a mother wouldn't have a life apart from her children at all, and that my children, for instance, have the God-given right to 24 hours a day of my time and attention. I actually don't think that's ultimately the best for them. And so what it means is sharing the task of raising my kids with our broader community. And that's actually a blessing and a good thing for all of us. It's, it's an opportunity for my single friends to engage in meaningful relationships with kids as they come alongside my children. And, a friend the other day took my daughter to her orthodontist appointment and then out for lunch while I took my other kids for a play date with some other friends, because it was a good deal for everybody, So just finding ways to actually live as if it is true that the local church is the primary family unit, while being, certainly very present for my children, and trying to just model for them the ups and downs of real life discipleship. the sins and struggles, the times I need to apologize to them for being grumpy and mean or whatever it is, and making sure they have a host of other adults who they can also take as models of what it means to live as a adult Christian.
Good.
Yeah, I think a lot of your advice reminds me of something that I read in Coddling of the American Mind, where those two authors commented, brought up this proverb of preparing the child for the road and not preparing the road for the child.
Right.
And I think, you're doing a disservice to your kid to just make you their sole emotional connection or to model that that's your job, or they're going to be a part of a community, they're going to be a part of a society, get them on that road. And I completely agree with your point about being neglectful. I think that would be completely inappropriate, but essentially teaching them along the way, discipling them, as you put it. Jonathan Haidt didn't talk about discipleship, of course, but I do think that that's a cool thing that parents can do, and I really agree with that.
Yeah, and my 13-year-old read that book, The Coddling of the American Mind, last year, and she came out and she was like, oh, pretty much everything my school is teaching is unhelpful, it turns out, in terms of helping children grow to be functional, resilient adults. She was like, oh, this is this is unfortunate. But yeah, trying to come alongside her. And again, Cambridge public schools are not hospitable places for serious followers of Jesus right now, in case anybody was wondering.
We were.
So there's real opposition there. There's real loss of friendship. There's she said to me multiple times, Mum, any day, or I could lose all of my friends in a day when everybody just decides that my beliefs are beyond the pale for them. And she's lost individual friends, but she hasn't had a kind of everybody cancelling her all at once thing. But she could. And I have to say to her, I understand that. And I know that's hard. And I'm here for you when you need to grieve that. But what I need to do here is kind of walk alongside you in that rather than too quick. There's a deep instinct and a good instinct in parents to want to protect their children. And there are times when we do need to protect our children,
Absolutely.
but there are also times when we need to equip our children
Yeah.
and be with them and say, do you know what? Following Jesus is hard. And I'm glad that you have the opportunity to learn that early on.
Thanks, Rebecca, for joining us on Dwell on These Things, and thanks for everyone for tuning in. You guys can find more resources at dwellcc.org and also RebeccaMcLaughlin.org. Thanks.